But
But I
Balam.
want to.
Okay, sorry.
Actually, sorry, Tanmay. I want to pick up a point, which is going to be like, which is the main argument of always, and I guess which sort of blends into the argument of synthwave is the analog versus the digital. This is the classic argument that everybody will have, and everybody has to have supposedly, you know. And technically, I feel like vaporwave and synthwave also belong in this argument because they're digital music. It's digital music, technically, right? Even if you're using synthesizers, which can be analog or not, it's still digital music, very very directly, right? So I've used a lot of analog equipment, and I've used a lot of digital equipment in my life. My life is not that long, but I've still used it in the how many X amount of years that I've been working, and um, I do get where you're saying where the digital is like right now, especially, it's way more supreme. You know, it's got all these cool things that you can't achieve uh, in real with analogs. But there are a lot of cool things that analogs can do also. Of course, I'm giving a very on the fence on the fence overview here because I've used a lot of especially pedals. You know, analog pedals. I've used a lot, and they have character of their own compared to digital stuff, which don't usually have characters, unless you get like a really high-end digital software, which is like getting a high-end analog software. You know, it's the same thing except it's digital and not. Now I feel like this kind of leads us into the synthwave vaporwave area because earlier they were using they were all everybody was using, especially 80s and then the rerun of the 80s where synthwave became a thing. They were using a lot of analog synthesizers to make these sounds, right? And now, of course, during this time, people have kind of taken those synthesizers and emulated them digitally and made them better, and so that you can, without having the very expensive analog synthesizer, just open it on your laptop and do the tweaking. Um, but yeah, again, that was the aesthetic. That was a vibe. Standing there playing your keys, turning the knob, changing the wave sine wave, and just making tripping people out with it. So I guess I mean this is a dark part of this is a dark argument to have on the internet, especially where everybody's listening and can hate us for it or love us for it depending on which side they're on. So that's it's just my point. Yeah, that they both are they've got their own vibes.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, plus one, they have their own vibe. I use an analog distortion pedal, obviously, so I can understand where you're coming from. I use, but it's also important to know, like a lot of people, and the reason I'm so critical of it is, like once you spend enough time doing something, you can tell when people are talking sense versus when they're talking out of their, like when they don't know what they're talking about, when they're not worth their salt.
Yeah, yeah.
And a lot of times for people it's just like hardware hai to analog ho gaya. Like no, it's not the same. Hardware versus software is different from analog versus digital, because you look at a Yamaha DX7, one of the most popular synthesizers of the 80s, was a digital synth. It's not analog. But for people, it's like, acha, if it's a real thing I can touch and feel, must be analog. A reverb pedal cannot be analog. It's always digital, because an analog reverb means being actually in that space to play it. That is analog reverb. So if you want to play in an airfield and that airfield is being recorded, or you're miking the airfield, that is analog reverb. But if you are if you are emulating an airfield through a pedal, then that's digital. Then like it stops right there. Then don't ever call it an analog reverb pedal, because it's not. And I also agree. So I think a lot of it ties back to the whole synthwave thing. It's the rise of synthwave which has let hardware come back. Like people are buying Moogs. People today, unlike say EDM producers from even 7-8 years ago, who were not really buying a lot because they were like, my laptop is enough and I'll just run Omnisphere, Silent, and make my banger. Today people are actually considering buying an analog synthesizer or like a vintage delay pedal which runs on like a Bucket Brigade thing, you know. So it's not going to give you 12 seconds of delay. Maybe it'll give you 3 seconds at most, but it's going to have that delay. Sonic characteristic is going to be so dirty that you might actually vibe with it. And it's coming back because of lo-fi and this synthwave culture. So again, like, it just ends up becoming about capitalism, but I guess that's what it is, you know, because these guys were out to rat it out. They were like, you know, you just can't stop buying things. And then like all these instrument companies were like, yeah, why don't you buy this to make your lo-fi record, you know? So next thing you know, you are buying a Moog clone, you know, like a Model D clone, to make the simplest of sounds, so that you can make a lo-fi record which is mocking capitalism. And then next thing you know, you're gonna go buy a Behringer synth.
I've been wanting to buy some analog synths myself. But
In
nowadays,
fact,
most of these companies are now pushing their things into softwares, which is pretty cool.
No, that's actually so. From what I've been seeing, it's actually the other way around. Like, software exists obviously, and software is a boon. Like, it's the greatest blessing for someone who tours a lot, or is just like, you know, in different places a lot. But for someone who has a home studio, hardware is coming back big time. You know, like, modular synthesizers are becoming a thing. I mean, they already were, right? But like, now having a small modular setup for oneself is something that people aspire to have, you know. Like, so you guys are guitarists, and I only recently started learning how to play the guitar. But I mean, unlike any other guitarist, the first thing I did was build my pedal board and then start learning the guitar, because I had a background with making music or like processing drum machines and synths. So I was like, okay, I can still use the pedals even if I don't know how to play the strings, right? So that's where it came from. But this is happening. People are now buying more hardware than ever. Companies are pushing out more hardware than ever. And it's not just MIDI controllers, it's proper synthesizers. Like, if you just open Behringer's catalog, you can tell that it's mass produced, mass customized things, because the frame is the same. You know, it's a rectangular synthesizer, tabletop synthesizer, which is like, it's basically a long rectangular synthesizer, and they have 7 retro variations of it. They have a Moog, they have a Neutron, they have a Pro one, they have a Cat, they have a strings module for it. And it's only because people who are so enamored by that retro sound now want that retro feeling of making music. Because suddenly making synthwave on a computer doesn't seem synthwave enough, you know.
Of course, yeah.
So I
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
I know that there's so many plugins obviously, and they will be the way forward. So let's say like we go on tour or something, then obviously you can't carry your synthesizers with you. But for your average bedroom producer, it has become another escape. It's like, oh, I'm gonna fire up my Mother 32 and I'm gonna play around with it, and I'm gonna get lost in my modular experimental zone. It's like, it's coming back. I don't know how or why, and I actually kind of appreciate it as well. It's just so important to note that these things which were deemed obscure, like vinyl was deemed obscure, and like, it was obsolete. Sorry, is coming back. Vinyl is selling more and more every year. I'm not saying it outdoes digital, but every year vinyl outdoes itself.
I get what you mean, and I agree with you on the synth part, that they're creating more hardware synths. But what I was talking about is kind of on the non-synth approach. I know that's kind of off topic, but it was more of, you know, how these guys who used to make instrument pedals and instrument effect hardware are now converting it to software. You know, like,
Right.
so like a lot of guitar companies who make all these reverb pedals, delay pedals, distortion pedals, these effect pedals, you know, modulation pedals, they're kind of converting to effects softwares, plugins like VSTs and all, so that you can use it and use that pedal specifically without having that pedal. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
Fender
So
does their amps.
yeah, exactly. No, but amps have been for a while. I
Yeah,
know
I'm
amps
just
have
saying.
are old thing where they had they have software amps, and then they have real amps, and they have just they're basically emulations of that, right? But I know recently that a lot of companies who still do make hardware pedals are making them software ready also, so that people can just buy it instead of having to buy the full the hardware box, the stomp box as they call it, and having it shipped over to them. They buy the software and they plug it their guitar into the computer live, and they use the pedal from the computer. You know.